Fifth Element Live. The elements of hip hop are DJing, graffiti, breaking, knowledge, and.
Yo, mama.
Biddy, did you come here to play or did you come here to finesse?
We can't all get a pair of socks?
I told you, Patrick, I was coming for you. I took you out.
You're still whack, copy?
What's going on, family? You're tuned into episode 17 of No New Leaders, a weekly show of words, beats, and life with my co-host, Dr. Jason Nichols. What's going on, Jay?
Ain't nothing going on with the rent, man. How you?
It's so funny, like, you always say that. you got a mortgage. You ain't got no rent. You probably ain't got no mortgage. But for real, what's going
on? Nothing much. You know, I'm kind of feeling myself because I predicted just about all the races for midterms, with the exception of one, which was Nevada. I thought that Republicans would win Nevada and Democrats pulled it out. But I got all those Senate races right. And I think I did not expect them to keep the House, which is a possibility. But yeah, so as a political analyst, I'm kind of feeling myself right now.
Well, that's what's up. That's so funny. I remember on the show that we did about the race, we had a guest who hit me up on Facebook to be like, I think you might want to tell your guy, Jason, he was wrong about X, Y, and Z. So I feel like you got Ohio wrong. You know, what was nope. Pennsylvania you got wrong? It was Pennsylvania.
Nope. I can show you all the evidence that I got all those right. Nope.
So you're literally telling me you ran the table every single race that you predicted.
I got Nevada wrong.
Okay.
I got Nevada wrong, and I may get this Arizona governor's race wrong. I thought Kari Lake was going to win that because I went to Arizona and I talked to people there, and there was just no excitement behind Katie Hobbs, like literally zero. Nobody was excited about her, even the Democrats. So I thought Kari Lake was going to win that. So if we're counting governor's races, then I may get this Arizona race wrong. And again, these are races that I'm glad to get wrong. You know what I mean? Like, I'm okay getting someone like Kari Lake losing. So, you know, yeah. So those are the only races that I got off. But I got Ohio. I knew JD Vance was going to win. I thought that Fetterman would limp over the finish line, and he did. I knew Florida was going to turn out the way it did. I got North Carolina, unfortunately, but you know, I would have liked to have seen more investment from the Democratic Party in Sherry Beasley's race, but she didn't win that. So yeah, I mean, I got all those, and I knew Mandela Barnes was going to lose in Wisconsin. I was hoping that, you know, I would be wrong, but you can't trust the polling with any of that because they didn't take into account new voters, and new voters are young voters, and young voters voted Democrat, and they actually turned out in this midterm, particularly with the Dobbs decision. So I was feeling myself, but definitely.
Sure, you hear that? For a change, Jason is feeling himself.
For a change.
Let me just dust your shoulders off just a little bit. You know?
He said that whole Democratic establishment that said there was going to be a red wave and they were already starting the circular firing squad. He was like, no. Holster those sidearms, people. I'm Dr. Jason Nichols here calling in the facts.
I said it on TV. They were like, watch, it's going to be a tsunami. I was like, no, not so much.
This is what I say, Jay, because I've listened to some of your political predictions in the past, and I've been like, I don't know about that, bro. So I'd love to see that videotape. But we've got a show to run here, and we've got a guest this week. One of my good friends and mentors and fellow Libras, Lee Perine, has joined us. And what I love about Lee is if you Google Lee, or better, if you were to look up Lee in the dictionary, there will be four definitions or descriptions. One would be curator / cultural strategist / creative producer. 2 would be Libra sun, Leo moon, Sagittarius rising. 4 would be married to a Leo, father of 5, uncle to many. And 4 would be lover of life, wearer of pearls, extensive expansive ambassador of joy. Expansive ambassador of joy. But then if you were actually to Google Lee, Lee could be described in the following. Lee Perine is a Washington, D.C. / Durham, North Carolina-based curator, cultural strategist, and creative producer. Lee's also the founder of Black in Space, an LGBTQ plus arts collective that celebrates the artistry, diversity, and resilience of Black LGBTQ plus communities through media, storytelling, and technology. When he's not in space, Lee is the community engagement manager at the DC Creative Affairs Office. Throughout his career, Lee has created platforms for creatives, especially Black LGBTQ plus creatives, to thrive in. And the way I met Lee is he reached out to me for a mural project in NOMA, back when he worked at the NOMA bid, to do what was then the largest public art installation in Washington, D.C., which was an acre wide and long in NOMA. Lee, what's going on?
How you doing? Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Perfect. Hello.
Lee, thanks so much for joining us. As you heard, Jason knows all things political as of today. Carrie hasn't chimed in yet with her expertise as a community organizer, focuser on all things elemental. I feel like we should call, like, even though her company is called Check the Weather, I feel like we should call her Captain Planet, because she's all about the earth and the things that we can do to be better inhabitants of the planet.
My
bio
ring fell out. My crystal fell out my ring. I can't even connect with my other planeteers anymore. It's a problem, but it's gonna happen. Yeah.
Well, Lee, I know I read a brief bio for you. Why don't you share a little bit beyond just the kind of, or maybe tell us a little bit about how you moved into this space. I know that you graduated from Duke, and Jason and I both graduated from Maryland, so naturally we have to hate you. But
I did go to college with Cameron, so I think that gives me some points.
That definitely gets you some love. But she also went to Duke, so sometimes I hate her too.
Okay.
So why don't you talk a little bit about, how did you come to do this work?
How did I come to do this work? Well, I think I've been bringing people together since like middle school. Like, I wanted to, like, it's just a way to like make friends. And I always found if I would like host something, like people would show up to it. And so it was like, I guess if you build it, they will come. And then in college, I threw parties and people came to the parties, and that's how I made even more friends. And then when I was in DC, it was about 2012, during DC Black Pride. They host a lot of events, but they were like, the parties are either very expensive, they had dress codes, it just really wasn't my style. So I was like, once again, I'm going to create the space that I want. And I also don't like to stay out super late. So I was like, I'm going to throw a day party. Teamed up with some friends, called it Freak Out. And that lasted for a couple of years. And then that led to a group called Makers Lab, which is an LGBTQ arts collective. And we produced dance parties, community events all over in DC from 2014 till about 2018. I ended it, came back in 2020, started creating events, virtual events during the pandemic, which was like Black in Space, and kind of been rocking and rolling with that ever since. But all of this has just come from a place of, if I don't see it, I'm going to create it, because somebody told me once, like, if you have the idea, if there's an event you want to attend, there's probably like 50 other people that would probably show up and support it. And it's actually happened to be true for my work. And so I've always been greatly supported in my work in DC, and have been very fortunate to create there. Now I'm in Durham, so we're going to see what happens down here. So that's how I got
what's
here.
up. Durham is lucky, almost as lucky as Aaliyah to have you. So it's so interesting. I've actually never asked you that question before, even though I've known you for years. And what's weird is that that's literally how it is I came to create WBL. It was like looking to see what was and what wasn't, and wondering, if we were to move in this direction, what kind of a difference could we make? I wonder, over the years, what do you feel like your impact has been as a creative leader?
My impact, so quite honestly, I will say this too, is like, when I started Makers Lab, I was like, I did want to be known as like a party promoter and like be popular. And at that point, I was coming out of a divorce. I was like, ooh, maybe I'll meet somebody out of this and start a new relationship. And so, you know, those are somewhat superficial reasons, but those are reasons, like real talk. But from that work, I think my purpose shifted, and I really noticed the power of community and what does it mean for queer and trans people, especially Black queer and trans people, to have spaces to really like see ourselves, see people like us, see the different possibilities. Like, at that point, like, you know, I identified as a lesbian, to meet other people who identified as trans and to see that there were other sides of myself that I could explore. And so I actively began like embarking on my gender journey. And that wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for the spaces that I created. And I know that people who have been in the spaces that I created kind of have a similar experience where they see possibility, they see themselves, they feel safe. A lot of people have called our experiences church. And so I think that's been the impact is like, I don't really take this work lightly. I know our impact and I know that we literally do save people's lives. And I know that we help people create families because sometimes like biological families aren't that supportive. So.
I mean, I think this is clearly super important work, and that it's meaningful for you and the community that you're a part of and that you helped to nurture over your time here in Washington, D.C. This question of representation, like people being able to see people that are like them, continues to come up in conversations in my circle, particularly among Black folks. This idea of needing to see people that are like you, to feel affirmed, to feel seen, literally, to be validated. How do you think that literally seeing yourself, adds value to the lived experience of people in your community?
I mean, for me, and it gives people hope. It gives people, again, like possibility, and I think a sense of connection. Because then it's like what I found is like, especially like on my gender journey, like then I would start to meet people. Then it'd be like, hey, can I like go on a walk with you? Like, can I have coffee? And so it just, I started to like, I started to feel seen. I started to feel bigger. I started to feel more possible. And I started to like, for a long time, I didn't think I was going to like make it past 40. And then I think when I saw that there was a way for me to live and be, and actually be myself and be happy and be embraced for that, then life after 40 seemed more possible. And so I think like that's one of the things why it's really important for people to see themselves and to see that, especially for like trans people, because a lot of trans people, you know, unfortunately die young for a lot of reasons. And so to also like see like older trans folks, like I think it's important to have that representation as well, to know that you can live into your 40s, 50s, and 60s and hopefully like be able to like thrive in that life as well. So
one of the things I've loved about attending your events, I'll be very, very honest. I've sometimes been uncomfortable because I recognize that the space isn't created for me. And so, but I also know that like, there are things about the spaces that I'm gonna say, this sounds terrible. I know like some of the events I've been to are heavily dance centered. So there's a lot of twerking.
yes.
But I also know that like the male gaze is like something that people don't want. And it's like knowing like, I know I'm here to support Lee. There are things here that are appealing to me. They're not supposed to be appealing to me because I'm not supposed to be here. And so like how do you create space where clearly it is for LGBTQ plus folks, but it's not saying nobody else can be there. It's like, but respect the boundaries we establish as a community for your presence. You know, it's kind of like the way in larger African-American communities, sure, we're going to do events that are open for everybody, but like every aspect of this isn't necessarily to be experienced the same way by every single participant. So like, how do you feel like navigating that space within kind of gender and sexual identity created spaces specifically for Black people is different or the same? Like, I'm trying to ask you questions mostly because Carrie and Jason haven't jumped in yet. So yeah.
Well, I mean, I'll say this. And so now that I'm a cis assumed male, like, so there's also been shifts in how the world sees me and how the world treats me. And so most of my in-person experiences are when I was read like as a Black woman. But with that, in terms of like Makers Lab and our in-person experiences, like with every event, we have a list of house rules. So whether it was a cis man in the space or anybody in the space, like ultimately it's about respecting the folks who were there and this idea of community care. And so, I mean, you know, we probably assumed that cis men would be, you know, I would say like more aggressive, or people we'd had to like quote unquote like keep an eye on in our space, but we actually kept an eye on everybody in our space and a willingness to check anybody's behavior that violated like folks' boundaries and safety, and willing to remove people from the space. So I don't know if it was necessarily about how people read you. It was how you respected the space and how you acted in the space. And because I don't know everything about you, all I know is you found out about this party, this experience, you wanted to be a part of it. And I think we come from a place of we lead with trust, and that the people that are there are really committed to sharing in the space and co-creating the space. And so we actually didn't really ever have that many issues, or where people felt like there was like that gaze upon them, or they felt unsafe. Like that was few and far between, I would say.
It's interesting though, because safety for members of the LGBTQ plus community in DC, I'm sure has been an issue for a long time, but came to the forefront. I feel like it was the last Pride where someone was literally physically dragged down a set of stairs.
Oh, and Nelly's.
Yeah. And so thinking about safety, because I think a lot of times when we talk about safety, it's much more the extreme version of unsafe, like literally people being assaulted or killed. But there's all different levels of safety that someone like yourself, who's organizing events specifically for people in a community that has to deal with multiple levels of safety concern, whether that's being a Black person in America, being an LGBTQ plus person, being a woman identifying or presenting person, like, or being trans, like all of these different layers of safety and caution and concern. And so I wonder, like, what does leadership in that space really look like?
Leadership has looked like listening. I'm in my 40s. I feel like there was a lot of language and ways of organizing that I didn't always have a clear understanding of, but I was fortunate to create, and still now to create and build with folks in their 20s and 30s who have introduced me to a different ways of moving and being and creating space. And so I've let them take the lead on, like, and they'll call me like uncles. They'll be like, Uncle Lee, here are the things we need to do when we bring people together. And they'll like push me on things I've never heard of. Like, one, they'll educate me, and two, they'll be like, we really have to make sure we're cognizant of these things and we hold true to them. And so I think for me, it's been a willingness to like listen and take a step back and not assume I'm the expert, and really trust the people that I brought in and who want to do work with Black in space to help us, like, again, like co-curate the space that is going to be safer for our communities. Like, it will never be 100% safe. We cannot guarantee that, but what can we do to make things safer? And that has really been me taking a step back and learning to listen, which is not what I did when I first started producing events. Like, I thought I knew best. I think that's been an evolution in terms of how I bring people together.
So Lee, I wanted to ask, as someone who throughout graduate school studied gender and a little bit of sexuality, it's certainly evolved a whole lot. The study of gender and the study of sexuality has certainly evolved. But I remember in one particular class, it was, it was an interesting space to be in as a straight cisgender male, where there was this argument between, about trans identity. I don't even think at the time, I'm dating myself, but I'm not even sure we used the word trans at the time. But part of the discussion was some women, particularly lesbian women, felt as though trans identity was a desire by some to get the benefits of male privilege. Now, the only reason I'm kind of starting the question off with that is because I'm wondering, do you get resistance in curating your events? First of all, you're in the Bible Belt, you're in the South, you're in Durham, North Carolina, and do you get resistance from other members of the LGBTQ movement or community for the events or the openness of your space?
So I've been in Durham all of 2 weeks. So I have not started curating here. No, I just got here. My wife was like, "Are you ever moving here?" And I was like, "Yeah, you're right, baby." So I got here. I've been here 2 weeks. But having produced in DC since 2012, actually probably before then, I can definitely speak to that. So I also tell people I am a trans man of lesbian experience, right? So I grew up in lesbian spaces. I was taken care of by lesbians. Like, that is what I know. And so when I transitioned, I actually found that I had to start creating spaces that were different, and those spaces probably skewed a little bit younger because they were more accepting of spaces under this queer umbrella. So that would be more like trans folks, gender nonconforming folks. Like, there was a little bit more openness, and I would find that people who or my peers really wanted like lesbian only spaces, and I understand why they needed those spaces, right? And so I actually had to go through a grieving process because those were no longer my spaces. Those weren't for me, and I had to now create something else that was more more welcoming, I would say, for like trans and gender nonconforming folks and people more along the spectrum, right? And so there's definitely been some pushback. Well, I don't necessarily want to call it pushback, but I understand why certain spaces have to exist, and I will create other spaces, right? And that they're all needed and necessary, and just recognizing like where I belong and that I don't belong everywhere. And so checking myself about the spaces that I enter.
That's dope. I'm wondering, I respect that because that is a dynamic that oftentimes happens. But I'm wondering about how your leadership or even your experience has been transitioning from in transitioning into more of a cis presenting male. How has the external how has that been for you? I don't know how to say that. Like how you build leadership. And I love that you mentioned just the intergenerational approach and how more younger generations may be more accepting of identity in a different way. So yeah, just wondering about that.
So I think even before there was like figuring out the leadership stuff, but I think there's even figuring out the masculinity and how I wanted to embrace masculinity and how I wanted to present as a masculine person. And there was just like so much I didn't know. Like, I didn't know how to tie a tie. I didn't know rules about like suit jackets and neck sizes, like just all this stuff. And so my older brother and like other men in my life becoming my teachers and guides as I'm like embracing like, this new way of being and being seen in the world. And so I think that has been like there's just so much to learn. So I guess in some ways it's like felt like an adolescence. I think when it comes to how I lead, I think now that I'm cis assumed, it's actually opened up the ways in which I want to curate. So I think before, when I was a Black lesbian, right? Like, I pretty much specifically created spaces for like Black, queer, and trans people. I think now that I'm on this more like trans masculine side of the spectrum and being read as cis assumed and developing relationships with like Black people who aren't queer and trans, because honestly, like Mozzie was like my one friend outside of like my queer world. It was probably him. So now that I'm starting to develop relationships with people who aren't queer, wanting to create spaces for Black people, period. And so even that's evolved too. Whereas before, if you would have told me years ago, I would just think it would be only Black, queer, and trans people. But now it's, what does it mean to create space for Black people? And so I think even that has like been a shift I wasn't prepared for.
So another question I had, Lee, is when you talked about the family element of it, I thought that was really cool because it reminded me of Paris is Burning and where they had the houses and I guess my question is, part of that in something that I think is often not talked about in Paris is Burning and other documentaries and books about the trans community, particularly in New York City, where you get a lot of the documentaries are centered, is that there's a class element to it. A lot of these people come from working class or even impoverished backgrounds. Some people are homeless. What is the class dynamic for the events that you put on in Washington, D.C.? Was it, were these like working class people or were these, more, upper class or middle class people?
My audience, I would say, is primarily like college educated, like Black, queer, and trans folks who are probably like, taking a gender studies class or were majored in like, AFAM, things like that. But also we had folks who I would say folks though in terms of class, that was like the primary audience, but I think we did have a spectrum of people. And also though, in that commitment of how we designed the space, like yes, tickets could be like $10, $15, but we also like, if people didn't have the resources to pay for the party, they could still come to the party. So we never turned anybody away. And I think that commitment in our language in terms of how we created and how we promoted our events, everybody is like welcome at our parties, right? And so like I try to have an abundant mindset, and so I know that the resources will come so that all the artists can get paid, so that everybody can get taken care of, and the people who need to be in the space can be in the space, even if they can't afford to be there. And so,
I love how you mentioned that, especially around different class dynamics. And one of the things that I love about being in the DMV area in general is that there is a very strong Black queer identity. So even when we think about the first couples that got married in DC when equality in marriage was legalized, were Black women. So like that's a powerful thing to say. But I often wonder about when we think about class structures and what are the needs within the LGBTQ movement, how does that play out? What does it look like to create spaces that, and also language that is inclusive for all? Have there been moments, especially when we talk about policing experiences, and I don't want to say policing, but like how we look at what may be considered harm or what may be considered just a normal activity in different frameworks? How has that played out in those spaces? And has there been those clashes where it's really just how we explain something? Sometimes when we get into our collegiate rhetoric, and I can say that especially on the climate justice end, we can disconnect from some of the same people that we're targeting and that we are acknowledging are hurt first and worst when it comes to policies.
yeah, no, and thank you for that. So we've only like, especially with like Black in Space, because Makers Lab had taken a 2-year hiatus, and we came back in 2020, and that was the beginning of the pandemic. And so up until this past spring, like a lot of our stuff, or summer, a lot of our stuff was like digital, virtual. But even with that, the digital spaces that we created, the virtual spaces that we created, like one thing that I have really, I would say, held strongly to is like we have to make whatever we do as accessible as possible. And so, I do have the friends with like, the PhDs and the people who have all the language and the rhetoric, and at some point I'm just like, stop, like I don't know what it is you're saying. Like, how do we make everything that we are doing as accessible as possible? And so I do think that is like one of our core values in terms of how we organize. And so, like, even though our audience are those folks who know all the language, I don't think we present any of the things that we do in our content in a way that is like, I think there is a commitment to accessibility in all of its forms, and so really hold to that. So yeah.
I'm
So
curious,
what
Lee, just
advice?
because. Go ahead, Kay.
My bad. Thank you, Mozzie. I had one quick follow up.
Yeah.
What advice do you have for folk, because language is continuously changing? What advice do you have for people when it's like, damn, I was just raggedy, like I accidentally misgendered somebody, or I didn't say the right terminology, and now I feel like I'm messed up. So sorry, Mozzie. I think I might have cursed. My bad. But I mean it in the way that what does that mean? What advice do you have for folk as they're navigating changing language?
Well, because I feel like I get the language wrong, or as the language, because the language changes so quickly. I feel like I'm often still learning, and I feel like there's people who have different philosophies around like what you're supposed to do, like when you misgender somebody and how do you handle it. But so for me, I'm one of those people. If somebody like misgenders me, if they, I think I go back and forth, right? So if it's like with my family, then I'm more likely to like say something like in a loving way. So I think it's like, yeah, I don't know if people should necessarily be apologizing all the time. It's just like doing the work to get it right so that you don't have to like keep apologizing, right? Like just like learn somebody's pronouns and like stick to them. And so, quite honestly, I'm not even, now that I think about that question, like I'm not even sure because yeah, I don't even know. Yeah. I'm not even gonna like fake the funk and be like, here's what you should do, because I don't. And I'm a member of this community, and I'm sometimes like confused by what I should and shouldn't be doing, you know?
I remember, so I don't want to spend too much time talking about, I don't want to spend too much time talking about the transition, but I remember one of the things that you talked to me about when you started to become more cis presenting and the experience of like having literally white women clutch their bags when they would be in an elevator with you. Do you feel like that actually the experience of having people recognize you as a Black man is part of what is driving this desire to potentially reach more audiences, to continue to create the spaces for the LGBTQ plus community, but also recognizing there's also value that you have to contribute to the larger Black community and larger communities in general?
Yeah, I remember like the first time like another Black man was like, "Hey brother, what's up?" And I paused because I was like, "Well, I know he's not talking to me," but he was. And then that started to happen like more and more on the regular, and there was like this softness and community and connection and kindred that I started to feel. And I think there was a time, like especially like, and I don't want to say this for like all lesbians, but I was fearful of men, right? I think I didn't always like trust men or know how to be around men. And so, but now like, yeah, moving through the world is like cis assumed as a Black cis assumed man. And then when other like Black men like say hi to me and like do the dab, and I still get the handshake wrong. I'm still working on it. But just like the level of connection, I was just like, oh, like, I don't know. There's just something about it. Like every time it happens, and it does happen more and more often, I'm just like, oh, okay. Like I rock with it. Like I'm thankful for the experience. And it's like, and I want to connect with more Black men, because there's also like Black masculinity and masculinity in general can be done so many ways. And so just like being around people and who, yeah, are really doing like masculinity on their terms. And so I need to be around other masculine people, not just folks who identify as like LGBTQ.
So you talked. I'm sorry. I said cis presenting. I should have said cis assumed. Can you talk to us about Black in Space? Because this, I feel like, is one of the most. And I've known a number of projects you've done. Your parties are legendary. Witnessing the recap videos, knowing the DJs that you book, the idea that you brought Big Frida to DC before Drake, before Beyonce discovered them. So like, can we talk about this idea of how you've shifted to not just doing the events in person, but thinking about events that are virtual, that allow a different kind of creativity for yourself and the folks that you collaborate with?
Yeah. And so real quick on Honey Groove, when we bought Brick Frida, thank you for coming to that, Mazi. I remember you being there. I got to give shout out to Carisha Deschamps, who was the founder of Honey Groove. She's the one that introduced me to Big Frida and was like, we're going to have her a Honey Groove. And I was like, well, who was that? And then she played Big Frida's music and I was instantly sold. And so big shout out to Kai and the whole Honey Groove team for what we were able to create for those years. But I would say in terms of Black in Space, so I'd mentioned like Makers Lab had taken a hiatus. We were going to come back in May of 2020. I always do a series of events during DC Black Pride. And that year was going to be called like Say It Loud. I think we had like 4 or 5 events. And then the Rona hit. And so I was like, well, we're just going to have to cancel everything because like we were supposed to have these in-person events. Like, what are we supposed to do? How do we bring community together? But then I was talking to people, like checking in with people because, we're all at home and everyone's like freaked out. And so I came up with this idea. I was like, well, we're just going to have a 1-day virtual dance party to celebrate DC Black Pride. We're going to like use this technology to like bring community together. But somehow that 1 day turned into a 5-day festival with like 33 different events. And, we were talking to the folks at Movement at BLM DC, and we're like, and because they were going to like help sponsor the event. And we're like, well, what is it that the community needs right now? What is it around like mutual aid? Like what's happening? They're like, folks need masks. And I was like, all right, well, as a part of the festival, we're going to get like 500 masks that y'all can like donate to folks in Ward 7 and 8. And so the festival just like kept growing, like how we were going to take care of the artists, take care of community, making sure all of our events were ASL interpreted, And so this team came together in like, I think it was about like 6 weeks to produce this event. And so when I came up with the Black in Space, the only money I had at that point was like that first stimulus check. And then we started selling tickets and we were able to get sponsors. So in that time, I think we raised like almost $30,000, but that's how we produced the festival. And from that, there was like so much energy that then launched like Black in Space into like Woolly Mammoth Theater Company reached out, was like, well, we want to partner with you all. And like we took over their newsletter. And then the Hirshhorn reached out. And then Highlander Research and Education Center reached out. And then since then, people have just been like wanting to collaborate with us. But all of that grew out of being the pandemic, being at home, being scared, not knowing what to do, wanting to find ways to connect with community. And then that became this like festival. And basically we had like programming. It was almost like, it wasn't like round the clock programming, but over those like 5 days, Memorial Day weekend, like leading up to that Monday, like you could tune in on our Zoom channel and then just like get all this content of like Black, queer, and trans people. And so some people who'd gone to in-person prides said that was actually the most they connected they'd ever felt at a pride, was in a virtual space than they actually felt in an in-person space. So that's how we got there.
I'm curious. So I know that you continue to do Black in Space, but what do you feel like is special or important for people within the LGBTQ plus community, but also beyond, to be thinking about in terms of the use of virtual space to create community across greater geography?
Well, and then I think that's been the beauty of Black in Space. I think it's a couple of things, right? So it's like, one, we're able to create this content that can like live on, and that can be like viewed by people around the world. And so, you know, if it wasn't for the pandemic, I don't think I would have even been considering like creating art or making spaces that can be attended by people, like larger audiences. Like I think I probably would have just focused like, oh, I do these things in DC. They're very like DC specific. But now because of Black in Space, I'm like, oh, there's like Black LGBT communities around the world. And it's like, how do we connect as communities? How do we share our stories? Like, how do we learn from each other? And so, yeah, I think it's just really, in a beautiful way, like pushed us to dream bigger and to think about larger platforms, and to like really think about like how we create content that it can be like shared easily. And I think, you know, but even as I look at like how we produced in 2020, how that shifts now, especially as like people's attention spans get shorter, right? Like, what does it mean? Like, what are the ways in which we need to continue to evolve to like connect with our communities? And it's even things like we're not on TikTok right now, but we probably should be, right? Or like, what are the directions that we want to head in? Is like, how do we really want to embrace technology? What's for us? Like, what isn't for us? But I think with all of that, having this like openness to just like to be willing to try new things, and to also not be good at everything that we try.
And I think along those same lines, Lee, who are some of the creators that inspire you? Like, I know, even though our aesthetic doesn't really look like it, I stay loving the work of folks like Afropunk, just because it's the artists that they bring in and the people that show up to be a part of the work that they're doing are just beautiful and inspiring and amazing. And I feel, to be honest, I feel like when I've gone to your events in person, I feel like you have that same kind of crowd of like beautifully creative people driven who are not bound by like, you know, the same kinds of restrictions, but are willing to experience a different level of freedom. But who are the creatives or creators that inspire you?
The creators who inspire me. So I always say like the reason Makers Lab exists, I mean, it exists for lots of reasons, but one of the people's work that inspired was actually Jade Foster, who was a Washington, D.C. born poet, filmmaker. She had this tour called The Revival, where she put like, I think it was like 5 women in a van and drove them from like all over the country doing this like spoken word tour. And I was just like just her ability to like dream big, find the resources, and produce this tour, and then turn it into like a feature-length film. Like, Jade is really inspired my work, and like somebody I can connect with. I often find that it's actually like my friends and fellow artists. Like, DC has such a beautiful community. So whether it's groups like Boomscat or B Steadwell, you know, and even thinking about Boomscat as a group, and then individually, like, you know, Patience and Asha, the work that they do. And so I think I'm actually inspired by folks on a local level and seeing what they do, because that's stuff that I can feel and impacted by like more directly. But if I'm looking on a larger level, there's a lot of things I like about, like to your point, Mazi, like Afropunk. But I'm also inspired by like musicians like Sylvester, obviously like queer icons like Audre Lorde. I think I'm inspired a lot by like historical figures, and like bringing like those leaders and those voices to a younger audience, because I think sometimes people are disconnected from like our Black queer elders. And then what else inspires me? Yeah, I think those. But DC's uh, art scene and Black queer and trans community really inspires a lot of what I do, and just the way I live just inspires everything. So.
So I just want to say that the unsung on Sylvester is amazing. If you haven't,
Yes.
if you haven't seen that,
Oh
it's
no, I've seen
amazing.
it. Yes.
Yeah, no, it's great. So what do you think your future is? Like you said, you just moved 2 weeks ago. Are you going to try and do something similar down south, or are you still going to like come up and do things in Washington D.C.? What's the future for your organization?
So many things. I think so. DC is home. Although I'm originally from St. Louis, DC is home, and so I do think I will still continue to produce as part of Black in Space in DC. But I think it's going to be fewer events and more situated around like DC Black Pride, and so maybe a couple of larger events each year. And then I think when it comes to Durham, I mean, I've been creating events for so long, producing events for so long. I think there is some interest to produce down here, but then I also think there's something to be said for being still for a little bit and just like tapping in and connecting to this community, and what does it mean to just attend and build and not always trying to be the producer. So right now it's like, in the 2 weeks that I've been here, like going to different events, meeting people, and then maybe like in a year's time or something like that, maybe even 2 years, I don't know, evaluate and see. But so it's like, yeah, definitely still the occasional production in DC and visiting friends and family up there, and then kind of seeing how I fit in Durham, and not also when I was in DC, I feel like all I did was work, and so not necessarily bringing like all of that energy down to Durham, and what does it mean to have more free time, to play more, to be in nature, to not always be doing something and be so overscheduled. So it's all kind
And
of
not have your wife complaining about you working all the time.
exactly right. So she would like us to go do fun things together, and not always being like, oh, I've got this project or this deadline, or because you can always be busy. So kind of moving away from that.
So we were talking on a last show about the what is the fate of social media, and you mentioned how a lot of people felt even more connected in the virtual space than in the in-person space. So what does the future look like for these virtual events now that the world has opened back up?
Virtual events are really tough now, because I feel like one of the things is when we did Black in Space, like we were on like, what is it, stay-at-home order, so people really couldn't go anywhere. Now I think virtual events, it's just really hard to get people to attend, or if you do have an event, like you can't just have a Zoom party anymore. Like it has to be like well produced, and basically giving people like this really, really great experience, and not the license that we had, I feel like, at the beginning of the pandemic. So when it comes to virtual events, I'm not quite sure, because we haven't really been producing virtual events. But what I can say is we do have this commitment and desire to get better and better and better with the media that we're producing. So whether that's we're going to make a film about the first Black in Space festival called The Story of Space, whether it's like some of the video projects we've been commissioned to do, is making sure like those are like immersive excuse me, and dope experiences, and so that people can like really feel Black in Space like through that content that we create. And then virtual events, and we like live stream our in-person event, like the event we did with the ARC in May, we live streamed it, and so making sure people could have that experience. But like a solely virtual event, I don't know if we will necessarily do that again.
So Lee, I'm curious. When I read your bio at the beginning, one of the things that you talk about is being a storyteller, and I know that you've been working, maybe partially inspired by the work with Black in Space, but also maybe inspired by some of the people that you lifted up as being inspirations. You're starting to move into this idea of being a filmmaker as a storyteller, not just telling stories through events. Carrie asked about social media, but what about kind of traditional media and your own future work? What do you see as like if we had this conversation again 10 years from now, what are the things you'd like to have accomplished related to this work?
Yeah, no, I just wrote it down the other day. So there's 3 projects that are really important to me. So one is telling the story of space about the Black in Space Festival, but also making the connection to the first DC Black Pride, because Black Pride is a movement that is around the world now, but folks don't often realize or know that DC, like the first Black Pride was held in DC, in 1991, I believe it was 91, in response to like the HIV and AIDS epidemic, right? And so like everything that has been born out of DC as relates to like Black, queer, and trans people. I think people like to talk about Brooklyn, they like to talk about Oakland. People don't talk about DC enough. And so using that film to also make that connection like past, present, and future. So the first one, Story of Space. The second one, as I mentioned, like I'm a trans man of lesbian experience. I'm also a member of a Greek letter organization. And so what does it mean? And my mom is a very active member in that same organization. And so what does it mean to have this relationship and this connection with this sorority, but now you have this very visible like trans son. And so, but she's also been like vocal about having a trans son and also being extremely supportive. And so I'm still trying to figure out like the log line for it, but I also just want to shine light on that there are Black trans folks who have supportive families, and kind of dispelling all these ideas that like folks aren't supportive of their trans kids. And so that's called I Want My Pearls. So that's like a story about me and my mom. And then the third one is Sylvester. I love Sylvester. There's actually a huge Sylvester painting behind me, which you can't see, but I need to hang it. So Sylvester actually performed at a space called the Clubhouse, which was a Black LGBTQ nightclub in DC in the 80s. And so documenting like the night that he performed at the Clubhouse. So I've already conducted interviews with Christopher Prince, Racine Pendarvis. So I really wanted to like tell the story of that night. So those are the 3 projects. But then sometimes I wonder when it comes to Sylvester, if I actually wanted to end up like working on a larger, like what's biopic about Sylvester, because he really is my greatest inspiration. So I think those are the 3 media projects. But I think also though, I don't think necessarily film is going to be the only way that I create. And so just really staying open. Like I want to do stuff around soundscapes, just staying open to all the different ways to tell stories. So, yeah.
Well, let's stay in touch, because I've gotten into film, and I definitely, I don't know, I'm from the Baltimore area. When I was growing up, there was an artist by the name of Miss Tony, who was a big deal in Baltimore. We all loved her. It's difficult because I believe he was a gay man in drag and not trans. So it's but again, we didn't have the language, so it's hard to say. So I'm going to use he. Was an incredible artist and really birthed a lot of the Baltimore club music. So if you're ever interested,
Yeah.
let's definitely stay in touch and talk about that.
Yeah, no, I'll definitely send you a note. Yeah. And there's actually another project about Baltimore club music that I wonder if you're connected to, so I'll send you a note about that.
Most definitely.
So, yeah.
Well, so one last question from me, at least, Lee, that's been inspired by, so we started off this show talking about the election and how battles for trans rights around the country were used as a kind of flashpoint in more conservative states to try to argue against the efforts of the Democratic Party, specifically around things like continuing to have the conversation, speaking of North Carolina, of access to bathrooms, but also access to athletics. I wonder, what would you say are the issues that are top of mind as priorities for members of the trans community? Because a lot of what bubbles up to national media is people responding to people trying to create accommodations. I wonder, are those accommodations things that members of the trans community are actually advocating themselves for as a community, or are those just individuals who are trying to get access to things? I wonder, what are the things that you're not the spokesperson for all trans people, but I wonder, as a person that's closer to the community, I think, than anybody else that's on the show, what are the things that trans folks are actually most concerned about advocating for? So for those of us that want to be in allyship, know like these are things that are actually important to them, not just things that we think would be important.
Yeah, and so I think one of the things I want to do is more work around supporting trans youth, and I think some of the issues that affect trans youth that affect trans folks of all ages is, excuse me, is like access to healthcare and access to, um, people say gender affirming, but I often like to say they are life saving surgeries, and so it really is about healthcare and to be able to go see therapists and people who are going to support you on your gender journey and to be affirmed in who you are as a person. And so like that is what like young people need, and I think you know, with all of its issues, like one good thing about social media is, especially like if you're living in areas where you may not have all the access, at least you can like go on like TikTok and Instagram and see people like yourselves and like feel like a part of a community, even if it is only online. But we have to make sure we get to the point where when people do seek healthcare, and then whether it's like doing hormone replacement therapy or wanting to have surgeries, and not every trans person wants to have surgeries. It's very like an individual experience, that people can do that in environments where they're going to be like loved on and receive like supportive and safe healthcare. And so it's really making sure that like, yeah, trans youth are taken care of and supported and have access to healthcare. And then just in general, trans people, because I did not transition until I was like in my mid to late 30s, and I still needed those same services. So
Lee, I'm curious because you talked about basically being an ambassador of joy, and you talk about love a lot. And so I wonder, can you talk to us about what it's like to be a part of a community that really is supportive and affirming and celebratory of its members? Because like you said, not everybody is have, like in your own case, not everybody doesn't have supportive parents. Like, what is that story of love and affirmation that we feel like more people should know are relevant, not just for the trans community, but also for the larger LGBTQ plus community?
I think what's resonating with me is just this idea, and like even as I think for the longest time I would be like, oh, this is like my bio family, and this is my chosen family, and chosen family referred to like the folks I'd met through like being a member of the LGBTQIA community, queer and trans folks, right? But even now, like removing bio and chosen as my family is my family, and however I met you. So if I met you when I was like born and you were like my aunt, or I met you like 5 years ago at a party and we've connected and grown and learned how to love and support each other and be there for each other during like really great times and really difficult times. So this idea of that, like family really is whatever you make it, and like being around the people that bring you the utmost joy. And if that's not the folks that you historically spend a lot of time with and having to separate yourself from them, that's okay too. And I think when it comes to joy, I think it's just like doing all the things that you can, and sometimes you can't because of safety reasons, but when you can, just like really celebrating and being with your people and being loved on. And so yeah, I think that, but yeah, family is really expansive. And so to find your family and to hold on to them and love them and create new traditions and be willing to leave some things behind that no longer serve you.
So I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Jay. I was just saying that's a beautiful sentiment.
Yeah, agreed. So as a member of a Greek letter organization, have members of your Greek letter organization been supportive of your events, and have they, attended and promoted your events in the past?
I mean, I think I would say the people who are like queer members of those organizations come to the events, and I think they're happy to be in that space, but they don't wear their nail. They don't do any of that kind of stuff. And I think, I didn't join until like grad chapter, so my experience is a lot different than maybe someone who pledged at undergrad. And so I don't necessarily have like an active connection or relationship with those organizations, but those folks who are very proud and out members of those organizations, like, they'll go to their conferences and do their thing. But I also know there's a very different experience they have where they're in our spaces because they can be seen for all of who they are. Because I do think some people do, they do have to like tone it down when they're in certain spaces. So, yeah.
Well, Lee, I want to thank you for taking time to join us today to talk about the important work you're doing through Blacks in Space. Black in space, but also the kind of trajectory that you've been on through collaboration, through innovation, through rest,
Yes.
and even sharing the idea of coming to a new place and not saying, well, I'm just going to get out there and start making things happen. Let's find out what's already happening and figure out how I can be a resource. Jay, thanks for joining us for this call.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys.
Thank y'all. All right.
Thank you, Lee.
All right, take care.
Peace.
Peace.
All right, so that's another episode of No New Leaders this week with our guest, Lee. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Feel free to share it with someone who might also appreciate it. My name is Mazi Mutafa. I'm the Executive Director of Words, Beats, and Life. I want to thank you for your time because you didn't have to give it to us. All right? Peace.